right now, I want you to just close your eyes for a second.
Okay.
And imagine your surroundings just entirely changing. You are sealed inside this steel tube.
A very small steel tube.
Exactly. Hundreds of feet below the surface of the freezing, violent Atlantic Ocean. There are no windows at all.
None.
The air you're breathing is, it's thick, it's heavy and metallic, saturated with this inescapable smell of raw diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and, that sharp, acidic tang of battery acid.
It's a sensory nightmare.
Truly. The curved steel walls, inches from your face, are constantly sweating with condensation. The space is so incredibly cramped that to get any sleep at all, you have to share a narrow, still warm bunk with a crewmate who just, rolled out of it to take his shift.
Right, hot bunking.
Yeah. And you can hear the ocean pressure groaning against the hull, literally compressing the metal around you. And somewhere out there in the pitch black, freezing water hundreds of feet above.
Someone is actively hunting you.
Yes. A surface warship is dropping high explosives, trying to kill you.
It's an environment that the human brain is just fundamentally not wired to handle, not for days, let alone months at a time.
Yeah.
And yet, tens of thousands of people lived, fought, and died in exactly those conditions. The story of the German U-boat isn't just, a catalog of torpedoes and tonnage and diesel engines.
Right, bigger than that.
Much bigger. It is a story of rapid, almost desperate technological arms races, massive geopolitical gambles, institutional stubbornness, and at its very core, the absolute limits of human, physical, and psychological endurance.
Which is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. We are taking you on this immersive journey into the claustrophobic, terrifying, and historically massive world of the undersea boat.
Literally the undersea boat.
The undersea boat. And looking at the massive stack of sources we have on the table today. We've got declassified operational logs, technical blueprints, century-old historical records.
Yeah.
We're going to trace this phenomenal engineering arc.
Because it really is an arc
Yeah.
from a very clunky start.
Yeah. We're looking at how a clumsy, highly experimental, and frankly dangerous iron tube evolved into this stealthy apex predator that nearly brought global empires to their knees. Not once, but twice in the 20th century.
And looking at the earliest records here, the very beginning of this technology is a lot earlier and significantly humbler than you might think.
Oh yeah, we are going all the way back to 1850.
That's right. A full decade before the American Civil War.
Wow.
Long before internal combustion engines were even a reality, a Bavarian artillery non-commissioned officer named Wilhelm Bauer designed this rudimentary three-man submersible.
The Brandtaucher.
The Brandtaucher, which roughly translates to fire diver. It was constructed in Kiel, essentially out of sheet iron, and the propulsion system was entirely manual.
Manual.
You mean, two men literally turning a massive treadmill-like wheel to spin a propeller.
Oh, man.
While the third guy steered.
I am looking at the sketches of the Brandtaucher in these historical archives, and it looks less like a weapon of war and more like a floating iron coffin.
Which is pretty much what it was.
Exactly what it became. Because this is 1850. The metallurgy, understanding of buoyancy, the sealing mechanisms.
Our tech just wasn't there yet.
It wasn't. On February 1st, 1851, during a test dive in the Kiel harbor, the hull just gave way. It sank right to the bottom.
But miraculously, the crew survived.
Really? How?
Bauer and his two men waited in the freezing darkness for hours. As the water slowly filled the cabin, it equalized the air pressure enough so they could eventually force the hatch open and swim to the surface.
That is terrifying, just sitting in the dark waiting for the water to rise.
Right. But while the men lived, the Brandtaucher itself was lost to the mud for decades. And that very public, terrifying failure essentially put a pin in human submarine development for half a century.
A 50-year gap.
Yeah, the naval establishment looked at that sinking and concluded that submarines were just a suicidal novelty. There is a massive gap in the historical record before we see the next major milestone.
Right. It isn't until 1903 that the Friedrich Krupp Germania Werft dockyard, again in Kiel, completes the first fully functional engine-powered German-built submarine. They called it the Forell.
The Trout.
The Trout. It was a tiny vessel about 13 meters long, powered by an electric motor. And you would logically think that having a fully functional submarine in 1903 would cause the German military to immediately snatch it up.
You would think so.
But the sources show the exact opposite. Krupp literally had to sell the Forell to the Russian Imperial Navy because the German Navy wanted absolutely nothing to do with it.
What's fascinating here is how institutional stubbornness almost made Germany completely miss out on the very weapon that would ultimately define their entire naval strategy.
Came down to one guy, right?
Exactly. The reason the German Navy rejected the Forel comes down to the singular vision of Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz. Tirpitz was the architect of the German Imperial Navy, and he had absolutely zero interest in submarines. He was utterly obsessed with building a massive high-seas fleet of expensive, heavily armored surface battleships.
To rival the British.
Precisely, to directly challenge the supremacy of the British Royal Navy.
We really need to put Tirpitz's mindset into the context of the era for you listening. At the turn of the 20th century, battleships were the ultimate status symbol of a global empire.
They were the nuclear deterrents of their day.
Right. If you wanted to be taken seriously on the world stage, you needed massive, floating steel castles with huge guns. To Tirpitz, and really to most of the traditional naval establishment, submarines were viewed as dirty, ungentlemanly, cowardly weapons.
Real naval battles were supposed to be fought out in the open.
Broadside to broadside, where you could look your enemy in the eye.
Tirpitz was looking at the ocean purely through the lens of traditional sea power. He couldn't or wouldn't see the asymmetric value of a vessel that could bypass thick armor by simply hiding beneath the waves and striking from below.
So what changed his mind?
It actually took foreign intervention and essentially capitalist peer pressure to force his hand.
Right.
Krupp, acting as a private arms dealer, received an order from Russia for 3 larger, much more capable submarines, known as the Karp class.
And when Tirpitz saw foreign navies actively buying German engineering while his own navy lagged behind,
he reluctantly realized Germany needed at least 1 submarine, purely for testing and evaluation to understand what they might be up against.
and that highly reluctant order becomes the SMU-1, officially commissioned in December 1906. Let's really look at this machine, because Germany is now the last major navy on Earth to adopt submarines.
They were way behind the curve.
The U-1 was a 238-ton vessel. It featured a double hull, an inner pressure hull to keep the crew alive, and an outer hydrodynamic hull to shape the water flow.
Its armament was incredibly light, just a single 45-centimeter torpedo tube in the bow.
And when it dove underwater, it ran on an electric motor powered by massive banks of lead-acid batteries, which was standard practice. But the real engineering puzzle was surface propulsion.
You need an engine to run on the surface and recharge those batteries.
Right. And for the U-1, they chose a Curting kerosene engine.
The choice of kerosene over gasoline is a critical engineering detail. Early submarines and other navies often used gasoline engines.
Which seems insane.
It was. Gasoline has a horrifyingly low flash point. The fumes would accumulate in the enclosed bilge of a submarine, and the slightest spark from an electrical switch would cause a catastrophic explosion.
So kerosene was vastly safer to store inside a sealed tube.
It was, and much more powerful and compact than steam power, which required massive boilers.
Okay, let's unpack this kerosene situation, because while it didn't explode, it introduced a fatal tactical flaw.
Very fatal.
A kerosene engine does not burn cleanly. The combustion process produced a massive, thick, highly visible plume of bright white exhaust smoke.
Huge problem.
Reading through the naval testing logs, this smoke trail could be seen from miles away on a flat ocean horizon. It is essentially the equivalent of playing a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek in a forest, but you are strapped to a white smoke grenade that goes off every time you take a breath.
That's a perfect analogy. It entirely robbed the submarine of its primary tactical asset. A submarine on the surface is not a battleship.
It has no armor.
None. It is incredibly slow, low to the water, and vulnerable to even light deck guns. Its only defense mechanism is stealth, the ability to vanish before the enemy can get a firing solution.
If a British destroyer can see your white smoke trail from 10 miles away, they know exactly where you are, where you're heading, and how fast. You're no longer a hunter.
Your target practice.
So the German engineers are looking at this white smoke problem and pulling their hair out. They try to brute force a solution in 1908 with the U-2 class.
Make it bigger.
Exactly. Make the boat bigger, add 4 torpedo tubes, and stuff more batteries inside so it can stay underwater longer and hide the smoke. But the kerosene engines are incredibly temperamental, constantly breaking down.
It isn't until between 1910 and 1912 that propulsion technology finally catches up to the tactical need.
A diesel engine.
Reliable, heavy-duty marine diesel engines from companies like MAN and Germaniawerft finally become available. The shift to diesel is the breakthrough moment.
Because diesel fuel is safe to store, incredibly energy dense, and crucially, it can be tuned to burn relatively cleanly without that massive white smoke plume.
It fundamentally revolutionized the U-boat's viability. The German Navy immediately recognized the potential and placed orders for 23 diesel-powered U-boats across several classes.
U-19, U-23, U-27, and U-31.
These were much larger vessels, around 650 tons, built specifically to accommodate the heavier, more robust diesel engines. And they featured larger, more lethal 50-centimeter torpedo tubes.
So we have this narrative arc from 1850 to 1914. Germany starts late, fumbles through a half-century of disinterest, stumbles over the kerosene smoke issue.
But by the eve of World War I, they have quietly accumulated 48 submarines across 13 different classes.
They finally have a functional, stealthy underwater fleet. But this is still entirely untested in large-scale combat. No one really knows how a submarine is going to perform in a massive geopolitical conflict.
Which leads us to the explosive shock of 1914.
The First Global Submarine War.
The opening months of World War I completely shattered the naval establishment's illusions about the submarine. In September 1914, just weeks into the conflict, the German SM U-21 intercepted the British light cruiser HMS Pathfinder.
And what happened?
The U-boat fired a single self-propelled torpedo. It struck the Pathfinder's magazine, causing a massive internal explosion, and the cruiser sank in minutes.
This was a monumental milestone in human history. It was the very first time a warship had ever been sunk by a submarine using a self-propelled torpedo.
And if the sinking of the Pathfinder wasn't a loud enough wake-up call for the traditional battleship admirals, what happened a couple of weeks later on September 22nd absolutely broke traditional naval doctrine in half.
I'm looking at the action report of the SMU-9, commanded by Otto Weddigen. He is patrolling the North Sea and spots 3 British warships sailing in a line.
And these aren't small patrol boats.
No, these are armored cruisers. The HMS Aboukir, Cressy, and Hogue. Massive, thousands of tons of steel bristling with guns, crewed by thousands of men.
The U-9 lines up a shot and fires. The torpedo hits the Aboukir.
And here is where the asymmetric horror of submarine warfare reveals itself. The British captains were so unaccustomed to the threat of submarines that when the Aboukir exploded, they assumed it had struck a stationary naval mine.
So following traditional naval rescue protocols, the Cressy and the Hogue stopped their engines and moved in close to pull survivors out of the water.
They became sitting ducks. Weddigen, peering through his periscope, likely couldn't believe his luck. He calmly reloads his tubes, maneuvers his tiny 500-ton submarine, and sinks the Hogue.
And then he reloads again and sinks the Cressy.
3 massive warships, the pride of the British fleet, sent to the bottom of the ocean in a single afternoon by one tiny sub.
The psychological impact of this on the British Royal Navy was devastating. They were so utterly spooked by the realization that their massive, expensive ships could be effortlessly picked off by an invisible enemy that they actually ordered the mighty British Grand Fleet to retreat from the North Sea.
They hid in the safer waters of Northern Ireland.
It completely upended centuries of naval doctrine. The battleship was suddenly vulnerable.
However, while the U-boats were proving devastating against warships, their interactions with civilian merchant shipping were incredibly bizarre by modern standards.
Very bizarre. Initially, U-boats were ordered to operate under the constraints of maritime law, known as the prize rules or cruiser rules.
I was reading the operational logs detailing these prize rules, and it genuinely reads like high seas chivalry from a pirate novel.
Yeah.
It's almost comical in the context of an industrialized world war. Let's walk through how an attack on a cargo ship was actually supposed to happen under these rules.
Under the prize rules, a U-boat captain could not simply stay hidden underwater and fire a torpedo into the side of a merchant ship.
That was considered piracy.
Exactly. Instead, the U-boat had to surface, exposing itself entirely, approach the merchant vessel visibly, and signal the ship to stop its engines.
And then they would physically send a boarding party across the water in a small dinghy to inspect the merchant ship's cargo ledger.
They were looking specifically for contraband of war, munitions, weapons, military supplies.
If the cargo was purely civilian, they had to let the ship go.
But if they found contraband, they had to allow the entire civilian crew enough time to safely evacuate into their wooden lifeboats and row clear of the vessel.
Only after the crew was physically safe could the U-boat sink the ship, which they usually did by planting explosive scuttling charges in the hull or using their deck gun to save their precious, expensive torpedoes.
That is very polite destruction.
Excuse me, Captain, I need to check your cargo manifests. Ah, I see you have artillery shells. Please calmly board your lifeboat so I can blow up your ship.
That's literally how it worked. On October 20th, 1914, the SMU-17 became the first submarine to sink a merchant ship, the SS Glitra, entirely following these polite rules. Nobody died.
But doing this in a fragile submarine is basically suicidal.
Completely. The British started arming their merchant ships with hidden deck guns.
Right. A U-boat would surface to politely ask for the cargo manifest, and the merchant ship would suddenly drop a canvas tarp, reveal a 4-inch artillery piece, and blow the unarmored U-boat out of the water.
It only took a handful of sinkings before the German High Command realized the prize rules were getting their own men killed.
The broader strategic picture of the war also forced a radical change in doctrine. By early 1915, the German hopes for a quick, decisive victory in France had completely evaporated.
The Western Front had devolved into a horrific, stagnant, blood-soaked deadlock of trench warfare. Germany desperately needed a way to break the stalemate.
The Naval Command looked at the British Isles and realized a fundamental geographic weakness. Britain was an island that relied entirely on sea trade to feed its population and supply its war machine.
If Germany could sever those transatlantic supply lines, they could literally starve the United Kingdom out of the war. But to achieve a blockade of that magnitude, they couldn't afford the vulnerabilities or the time-consuming nature of the prize rules.
So in February 1915, Germany drops the hammer. They initiate the first campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare.
The polite rules are thrown out the window.
U-boat captains are given the green light to sink any merchant ship, even neutral vessels flying American or Dutch flags, in the war zone around Britain without any warning whatsoever. Spot the silhouette through the periscope, calculate the speed, and fire.
And what's amazing looking at the numbers is that Germany only had about 29 U-boats available for this campaign.
And due to maintenance and travel time, usually no more than 7 were actually patrolling around the British Isles at any one time.
Yet the impact was globally catastrophic, and it led directly to one of the most infamous diplomatic crises of the 20th century.
Lusitania.
In May 1915, a U-boat spotted the massive British ocean liner, the RMS Lusitania, off the coast of Ireland. Operating under unrestricted rules, the U-boat fired a single torpedo.
The resulting explosion, compounded by a second massive internal explosion, the cause of which is still debated by historians, sank the massive liner in just 18 minutes.
Over 1,000 civilians died, including 128 American citizens.
The international backlash was instantaneous. The United States was completely outraged. President Woodrow Wilson sent furious diplomatic cables.
The political pressure was so intense, and the fear of America entering the war was so high that the German Kaiser was forced to intervene.
He ordered a halt to the unrestricted campaign, commanding the U-boats to leave passenger liners alone and to only attack definitively armed merchant ships.
They ended up sending a large portion of the U-boat fleet down to the Mediterranean, where there were fewer American ships, just to keep them out of trouble.
It began a prolonged, agonizing diplomatic shell game. By early 1916, the German military pushed back. The land war was bleeding the country dry.
They convinced the Kaiser to allow the U-boats back into the waters around the British Isles, under a complex set of strict engagement rules designed to avoid angering the Americans.
But the ocean is a chaotic place. In March 1916, a U-boat commander mistakenly identified a cross-channel passenger ferry, the SS Sussex, as a troop transport and torpedoed it.
While the ship didn't sink, 50 people were killed, including several Americans.
Once again, Washington threatened to completely sever diplomatic ties, bringing them to the brink of war. Germany capitulated again, fully abandoning unrestricted attacks and ordering the U-boats to strictly follow the old, dangerous prize rules.
But the prize rules simply couldn't exert enough economic pressure to win the war. By the end of 1916, Germany is staring into the abyss.
The Battle of the Somme and Verdun had resulted in millions of casualties. The British naval blockade of Germany was causing widespread starvation among German civilians.
Desperation entirely consumed the German High Command. They looked at their fleet, now boasting over 120 operational U-boats, and they made a cold, mathematical, and massively consequential strategic gamble.
The German Admiralty presented a memorandum to the Kaiser. They openly acknowledged that if they restarted unrestricted submarine warfare and began sinking neutral American ships without warning, the United States would almost certainly declare war.
They accepted that as a hard fact, but they presented a mathematical calculation.
I am looking at the actual logic of this gamble, and it is terrifyingly clinical.
Yeah.
When we talk about shipping losses, the logs constantly refer to gross register tons, or GRT. For you listening, a gross register ton isn't actually a measurement of weight.
It's a measurement of internal volume. 1 GRT equals 100 cubic feet of enclosed space. It represents how much cargo a ship can physically hold.
Right, so the German Admiralty calculated the exact caloric needs of the British population and the material needs of their military. They promised the Kaiser that if they unleashed the U-boats without restrictions, they could sink 600,000 gross registered tons of shipping every single month.
The logic was brutal but clear. Sink that much shipping, and the United Kingdom would be starved into complete economic and military collapse within 6 months.
They bet the entire outcome of World War I on the belief that they could knock Britain out of the fight before the United States had the time to draft, train, equip, and physically transport a massive army across the Atlantic Ocean.
It was a race against the clock. So on February 1st, 1917, they rolled the dice. The U-boats were unleashed, with orders to sink everything that moved.
And Washington reacted exactly as Germany predicted. 2 days later, the U.S. severed diplomatic relations, and on April 6, 1917, the United States officially declared war on the German Empire.
But here's the crazy part of the history. For the first few months, the German mathematics were actually working.
It was an absolute slaughter. In April alone, U-boats sank a staggering 860,000 tons of shipping. They were systematically bleeding the British supply lines dry.
The British Admiralty was panicking, calculating that they only had a few weeks of grain reserves left for the entire nation.
The German gamble was on the verge of succeeding until the British finally implemented a fundamental shift in naval doctrine that changed maritime logistics forever.
The convoy system.
Prior to this, merchant captains argued that sailing in groups was too slow and made them an easier target. Ships sailed independently, relying on the vastness of the ocean to hide.
But a lone cargo ship is utterly defenseless against a U-boat.
Exactly. Let's really look at how convoys work, because it's not just about grouping ships together, it's about altering the geometry of the ocean.
That's a good way to put it.
If you have 50 ships scattered across the Atlantic, a U-boat is almost guaranteed to bump into one of them eventually. But if you pack all 50 ships tightly together, you leave thousands of square miles of the ocean completely empty.
The U-boat now has to actively search for this one specific grouping.
And when they finally find it, they realize these 50 slow cargo ships are surrounded by a screen of heavily armed naval destroyers equipped with hydrophones and depth charges.
To get to the soft, chewy center of the convoy, the U-boat has to expose itself to lethal anti-submarine forces.
The introduction of widespread convoys in the summer of 1917 was the immediate antidote to the unrestricted campaign. Shipping losses plummeted from over 800,000 tons a month down to around 300,000 tons.
That was still a heavy bleed, but it wasn't the fatal hemorrhage Germany required. The mathematical gamble had failed.
Britain survived. The massive industrial and manpower might of the United States began pouring into France. The German home front collapsed under the weight of the British blockade, and in October 1918, the U-boat fleet was officially recalled to port.
The end of the war brings staggering statistics. Looking at the final tallies, Germany built 373 U-boats over the course of the conflict. Of those, 178 were lost to enemy action or maritime accidents.
The human cost was severe. Over 5,000 enlisted sailors and 512 officers died in those freezing, claustrophobic iron tubes.
But the amount of destruction they inflicted on the world was unprecedented. Those U-boats sank 10 pre-dreadnought battleships, 18 cruisers, and an absolutely mind-blowing 5,708 merchant and fishing vessels.
Over 11 million gross registered tons of shipping sent to the bottom of the ocean. So, what does this all mean for the history of warfare?
It means that in the span of just 4 years, this highly experimental, initially rejected technology proved itself capable of threatening the economic survival of global empires.
It created legends out of ordinary men. Look at a commander like Lothar von Arnold de la Perrière. He remains the most successful submarine commander in all of recorded history.
He sank 195 individual ships, totaling over 450,000 tons.
And what's wild is that he rarely used his torpedoes. He achieved most of his sinkings by surfacing his U-boat and precisely targeting ships with his 88mm deck gun, which was vastly cheaper and more efficient.
We also witnessed the rapid, forced evolution of naval engineering to meet incredibly specific tactical needs. The U-boat stopped being a single, generalized design.
Right. When the German army captured the coastal ports of Belgium, the naval engineers quickly drafted the WWII class. Tiny 130-ton coastal submarines specifically designed to operate in the shallow, treacherous waters of the English Channel.
They developed the UC class specifically to sneak out at night and lay fields of explosive naval mines outside British ports.
When the unrestricted warfare campaign demanded massive numbers of boats, they standardized the UC to the design. marrying torpedoes and mine-laying capabilities into a highly producible platform.
And for the long-range patrols into the deep Atlantic western approaches, they scaled everything up to create the massive UB-3 class.
It was an absolute masterclass in rapid military engineering and adaptation under pressure. But then, November 1918 arrives. The armistice is signed.
And the terms dictated by the Allies regarding the U-boats were absolute and uncompromising.
Every single surviving German submarine was to be immediately surrendered to Allied ports. Most were studied and then unceremoniously scrapped.
And when the Treaty of Versailles finalized in 1919, the hammer comes down hard. Under the terms of the treaty, the nation of Germany is explicitly entirely forbidden from designing, building, or even owning a single submarine, period.
The story of the U-boat is legally over.
Or so the Allies believed. But engineering knowledge doesn't just evaporate because a treaty is signed.
This brings us to a fascinating era of espionage, loopholes, and covert military preservation spanning from 1919 to 1939. Because if you are a naval architect, how do you keep your nation's submarine engineering skills sharp and your blueprints updated when your country is legally banned from making them?
This is where the story turns into a geopolitical spy thriller. The answer is you offshore the entire operation.
The massive German shipbuilding conglomerate, Krupp, the same company that built the 4L back in 1903, sets up a dummy corporation.
They establish a front design office called the Ingenieurskantoor voor Scheepsbouw, or the IVS. And crucially, they headquarter this front company in The Hague, in the Netherlands.
The IVS was a brilliant piece of state-sponsored evasion. To the outside world, it was simply a Dutch marine engineering firm.
But behind closed doors, it was staffed entirely by veteran German U-boat designers. The IVS allowed Germany to maintain its commanding lead in submarine technology by designing, developing, and secretly overseeing the construction of advanced submarines for other sovereign nations.
I just marvel at the sheer audacity of this shell game. They took a national, highly classified military program, picked it up, and hid it in plain sight in a completely different country.
Let's look at what they were actually building. Between 1927 and 1931, the IVS designed the WWII-class submarine for the Finnish Navy.
To the British and French observers, Finland was just modernizing its fleet.
But looking at the classified blueprints, the WWII was actually the secret, fully functioning prototype for what would eventually become the legendary German Type 7 U-boat, the backbone of the World War II fleet.
In 1933, they built a tiny, highly maneuverable 250-ton coastal sub for Finland called the Vesiko. That was the prototype for the German Type 2.
They designed a massive, ocean-going 750-ton submarine built in a Spanish shipyard, which was later sold to Turkey. That vessel became the direct prototype for the heavy German Type I.
And it wasn't just paper designs. German engineers and disguised naval officers were actually traveling abroad to participate in the sea trials of these foreign-built submarines.
They were gathering hands-on, practical data on dive times, maneuverability, and engine reliability. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this outsourcing of research and development was the most critical factor in Germany's eventual naval resurgence.
It meant that when Adolf Hitler eventually tore up the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, the German Navy didn't have to start from scratch.
They hadn't suffered a 20-year atrophy of institutional knowledge. They had fully tested, debugged, state-of-the-art blueprints sitting in a drawer, completely ready for mass production.
The secret did eventually leak out, of course. In the late 1920s, an investigative journalist uncovered the covert funding flowing to these front companies, sparking the Lohmann affair.
It caused a massive political scandal and forced the head of the German Navy to resign in disgrace.
But he was quietly replaced by Admiral Erich Raeder, who expertly smoothed over the political fallout and just kept the secret program running in the shadows.
The real paradigm shift, however, happened in 1935. The British government, attempting to appease an increasingly aggressive Germany and trying to manage treaty breaches they could no longer enforce, signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement.
Britain formally, legally permitted Germany to build a submarine fleet, provided its total tonnage didn't exceed 45% of the British submarine fleet.
The ink was barely dry on that agreement before the newly reformed German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, revealed exactly what they had been doing in the Netherlands for 15 years.
Within a single week of the treaty being signed, Germany officially commissioned the U-1, a fully realized Type 2 coastal submarine. Over the next 12 months, utilizing the IVS blueprints, they commissioned an astonishing 36 U-boats.
But as this new fleet rapidly takes shape on the slipways, a massive, fundamental debate erupts inside the German Naval High Command.
On one side, you have the old guard fleet commander, Erich Raeder, On the other side, you have the newly appointed head of the submarine section, a veteran World War I U-boat commander named Karl Dönitz.
Dönitz and Raeder had fundamentally incompatible visions for how the inevitable next war would be fought.
Dönitz, looking at the geopolitics, firmly believed that war with Great Britain was coming, regardless of Hitler's political assurances to the contrary.
And as a veteran, Dönitz knew that fighting Britain meant fighting a relentless commerce war against heavily defended supply convoys.
Therefore, Dönitz passionately argued that the Navy should use every single ounce of their allotted treaty tonnage to mass-produce a massive, homogeneous fleet of medium-sized 500-ton Type 7 U-boats.
He believed that sheer quantity, utilizing coordinated group tactics, was the only way to overwhelm the British supply lines.
But Raeder's looking at this from a traditional balanced fleet.
He argues for a mix. A bunch of tiny Type 2s for defending the Baltic coast, some medium Type Cs for the North Sea, and a fleet of these massive, long-range, heavily armed 750-ton Type I U-boats to project power deep into the Atlantic.
But the reality of testing these boats quickly revealed some glaring engineering flaws. I was reading the sea trial reports for the big Type I and the early Type 7 models, and they had a nearly fatal design flaw: terrible maneuverability.
The maneuverability issues stem from the rudder design. Both the Type I and the early Type 7 featured a single, centrally mounted rudder located behind twin propellers.
Because the single rudder wasn't positioned directly in the high-pressure wash of the spinning propeller blades, the water flow over the control surface was weak.
This meant the submarines had an agonizingly wide turning radius and were sluggish to respond to the helm, particularly at slow underwater speeds when quick evasion is a matter of life and death.
Furthermore, on the Type 7, the single central rudder physically blocked the interior stern of the boat. This meant the single rear-firing torpedo tube had to be mounted externally, outside the pressurized hull.
Which means once you fire that rear torpedo in combat, it's gone. You can't reload a tube that is bolted to the outside of the hull while you are underwater.
The engineers quickly realized Raeder's massive Type I was a lumbering failure, and they scrapped the entire class after building just two.
To replace it, they designed a much better heavy submarine, the Type IX. And for Dönitz's favored medium boats, they heavily upgraded the design to create the Type WWII-B.
The WWII-B featured dual rudders, positioned directly behind the twin propellers. This instantly solved the sluggish steering.
More importantly, using dual rudders cleared out the central space at the stern, allowing the engineers to mount the rear torpedo tube inside the pressure hull, meaning the crew could now physically reload it during a battle.
By early 1939, with Hitler pushing for expansion, the German Navy formally launched Plan Z, an incredibly ambitious long-term naval construction program.
The dream was to build a massive surface fleet supported by 249 modern U-boats, aiming to directly challenge the Royal Navy by the mid-1940s.
But geopolitical reality moves faster than shipyard construction. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, triggering the outbreak of World War II, Plan Z was immediately scrapped.
The Grand Fleet didn't exist. Germany entered the second global conflict with only 56 commissioned U-boats.
And the numbers get even tighter when you look at the operational capabilities. Of those 56 boats, more than half were the tiny Type 2 coastal subs that didn't have the fuel capacity to leave the North Sea.
Only 22 U-boats actually possessed the operational range to navigate around Scotland and reach the deep waters of the Atlantic Ocean.
It is an incredibly small, fragile force assigned an impossibly monumental task. But before we dive into the grand strategy and the massive convoy battles of the Atlantic, we need to take a massive step back.
We need to look at the human element.
We need to understand what it actually meant for a human being to exist inside one of those 22 boats.
This is a crucial pivot. The strategic maps and tonnage statistics often obscure the grim reality of the technology.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want you to really visualize this space. We're going to take a walking tour from the very front to the very back of a standard German Type Sef U-boat, the workhorse of the fleet.
You have to imagine a hollow, reinforced steel pipe, roughly 220 feet long, but the actual pressurized living space inside is much smaller.
Packed into this pipe is thousands of pounds of complex machinery, high-voltage electrical systems, explosive warheads, and between 40 to 50 unwashed men. Let's start at the absolute front, the bow torpedo room.
The bow torpedo room was arguably the most vital space on the boat, housing the 4 forward-firing torpedo tubes. It was also, paradoxically, the primary living and sleeping quarters for the lowest-ranking sailors and the torpedo mechanics.
The space utilization was extreme. Below the metal floor plates, 4 heavy spare torpedoes were stored in the bilge, but there was no room to store the remaining spares below deck.
So 2 additional spare torpedoes were suspended by heavy chains directly in the middle of the living space, hanging right above the floor.
Try to picture trying to sleep in this room. Bunks are crammed tightly against the curving steel hull, weaving between valves and grease-covered torpedo loading mechanisms, and there are nowhere near enough bunks for the 40 men on board.
The U-boat crews operated on a strict system of hot bunking. 3 men would share 2 bunks in rotating shifts.
The absolute moment one exhausted sailor got out of bed to go stand his watch in the freezing rain on the bridge, he would immediately climb into his spot, pulling up sheets that were literally still damp and warm from his body heat.
And you are trying to sleep with a 1.5-ton high-explosive torpedo swaying on chains just inches from your head.
The only tiny silver lining for these guys was that once the boat actually engaged in combat, fired a torpedo, and winched a stair off the chains and into the tube, the physical room opened up slightly, granting them just a few more inches of breathing room.
Moving aft from the torpedo room, you pass through a heavy, watertight circular bulkhead door into the forward quarters. This space was slightly more comfortable, reserved exclusively for the officers and chief petty officers.
It was quieter, but the air was still dense. Beneath the wooden floorboards of this entire section lay the first of 2 massive battery compartments. Dozens of enormous lead-acid battery cells that powered the boat's electric motors while submerged.
The captain of the U-boat didn't even get a private cabin. He had a small, curtained-off bunk right in the passageway.
However, his bunk was strategically located directly across from the 2 most important intelligence-gathering compartments on the vessel: the radio room, packed with transmission gear and the Enigma cipher machine, and the hydrophone listening room,
where the sonar operator sat in absolute silence, listening for the faint rhythmic thumping of distant ship propellers.
Continuing aft, you step through another heavy bulkhead into the absolute nerve center of the U-boat, the control room.
This space is chaotic. It's the widest part of the pressure hull, but it is crammed with equipment. Right in the center is the thick steel shaft of the main observation periscope.
The curved walls are completely covered in an overwhelming array of large brass valves, massive hand wheels, and depth gauges used to control the dive planes, the rudder, and the complex system of ballast and trim tanks that allow the sub to sink and level out.
Beneath the floor plates here is the storage magazine for the heavy artillery shells used by the deck gun outside. And if you stand in the center and look straight up, you see a vertical, cylindrical metal tube with a ladder. This leads up into the conning tower.
The conning tower is a fascinating piece of structural engineering. It sits outside the main cylindrical body of the submarine, protruding upwards to form the base of the bridge structure you see on the surface.
But it is heavily armored and completely sealed inside the boat's pressure hull. During a submerged torpedo attack, the captain would leave the main control room and climb up into this cramped tower.
It housed the attack periscope, which was thinner than the main periscope, to create a much smaller, less visible wake of white water on the surface. But crucially, the conning tower also housed the mechanical analog data solver.
Yes, the data solver. We have to explain this because it's a marvel of 1930s engineering. This isn't a digital computer with microchips.
It is a dense, heavy box packed full of intricate interlocking gears, cams, and spinning dials.
The captain looks through the periscope, estimates the enemy ship's speed, distance, and angle on the bow, and calls out those numbers. The operator physically cranks those numbers into the gears.
The box instantly performs complex trigonometry in real time to calculate exactly what angle the torpedo needs to steer to intercept the moving target miles away, and it automatically transmits that steering data via electrical cables directly into the gyro compass of the torpedo sitting in the tube.
It's a mechanical brain doing deadly math.
And just above the captain's head in the conning tower is the main watertight hatch that opens out onto the open-air bridge, where the lookouts would stand tied to the railing in freezing Atlantic storms, scanning the horizon for smoke or aircraft.
Moving back down the ladder into the control room and continuing aft, you enter the aft crew quarters. This small space is where the petty officers slept alongside the boat's diesel mechanics.
It is also where you find the single solitary toilet facility designed to service the entire 50-man crew for a patrol lasting up to 2 months.
Beside it is a tiny, claustrophobic galley, essentially 2 electric hot plates and a small sink, where the boats cook miraculously prepared 3 meals a day. Below the floorboards here is the second massive bank of lead-acid batteries.
And finally, at the very back of the living space, you open a heavy door and enter a completely different world, the engine room.
This space is dominated by two massive, hulking marine diesel engines used for high-speed surface running and charging the batteries.
When these engines were running, the noise was absolutely physically deafening. You couldn't speak. Communication was strictly through shouting directly into someone's ear or using hand signals.
The engines consumed colossal, staggering amounts of oxygen to run, which had to be constantly piped in through an open hatch from the bridge above.
And regarding the exhaust, a submarine needs the ability to crash dive in less than 30 seconds if an airplane appears. They couldn't have a traditional, tall exhaust pipe sticking up into the sky.
Instead, the scorching hot diesel exhaust was routed down and mixed directly into the turbulent seawater as it exited the hull. This instantly cooled the gas and diffused the smoke, significantly reducing the boat's visual signature on the surface.
Behind the deafening diesels lies the final compartment, the electrical room. This space housed the massive electric motors.
When the submarine dove beneath the waves, the diesels were shut off, and the crew engaged clutches to connect the propeller shafts to these electric motors. They drew power from the battery banks, allowing the U-boat to glide through the water in near absolute silence.
Alternatively, when the boat was on the surface running the loud diesel engines, these electric motors were spun in reverse, acting as giant electrical generators to pump juice back into the exhausted batteries hidden under the floorboards.
On the larger Type IX boats, you would pass through one more door into a dedicated aft torpedo room. But on the standard Type 7, the single rear torpedo tube was simply crammed right into the chaotic space of the electric motor room.
You really have to synthesize all of this to imagine the sensory overload of this environment. It is inescapable. The overwhelming smell of unburnt diesel fuel permeates your clothing and your hair.
The sharp, metallic tang of battery acid is always in the air, and if seawater ever leaks into the battery compartment, that acid instantly reacts to create lethal chlorine gas.
Add to that the smell of 50 terrified, sweating men who haven't had a shower in 6 weeks. Add the claustrophobia of not seeing the sun.
And imagine the sheer terror of a depth charge attack. You are sitting in the dark, the lights have shattered, and you can hear the metal hull of your ship audibly groaning and popping as it shrinks under the crushing pressure of the deep ocean, waiting for the next explosion.
The psychological toll is almost impossible to comprehend.
Yet it was from inside these hellish, claustrophobic metal tubes that the German Navy launched the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest, most complex, and arguably most crucial continuous military campaign of World War II.
Which brings us to the operational reality of the conflict, spanning the early triumphs and the eventual catastrophic collapse between 1939 and 1943.
Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, later wrote in his memoirs that the only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril.
And looking at the sheer volume of shipping destroyed in those early years, it is incredibly easy to see why. The U-boats of World War II were vastly technologically superior to their ancestors from the First World War.
For starters, the hulls were constructed using high-tension steel alloys, and critically, they were fully welded together rather than bolted with traditional rivets.
Under extreme underwater pressure, rivets can pop or shear off, causing catastrophic leaks. A welded hull fuses the metal into a single, seamless, flexible tube, allowing the Type 7 to safely dive significantly deeper to evade depth charges.
To increase their operational range without taking up valuable interior space, the designers attached large saddle tanks to the exterior sides of the pressure hull to hold massive reserves of diesel fuel.
But the true game changers of this era were the advancements in weaponry and tactical communication.
Let's examine the primary weapon, the torpedo. Early in the war, U-boats predominantly relied on the classic G7A model. This was a complex weapon powered by a miniature, steam-powered internal combustion engine running on compressed air and decalin fuel.
It was fast, reliable, and carried a massive warhead. But it had a glaring tactical flaw. As the exhaust gases vented into the water, it left a highly visible, foaming white trail of bubbles pointing directly back to the submarine that fired it.
To solve this, German engineers introduced the G7E, an electrically propelled torpedo powered by internal batteries. It was slightly slower than the air-driven model and had a shorter range, but it left absolutely zero wake.
It was a completely silent, invisible killer in the water, perfectly suited for terrifying daylight attacks where the victim wouldn't even know they were under fire until the hull exploded. But perhaps the most devastating and mathematically complex innovation of the early war was the magnetic pistol.
Yes, let's talk about the magnetic pistol, because this completely shifts the physics of how you destroy a ship.
A classic traditional torpedo relies on a contact detonator. The torpedo has to physically slam its nose into the vertical steel side of a ship to trigger the explosive, punching a massive hole in the side below the waterline.
That is obviously devastating and often sinks the ship. But a magnetic pistol doesn't need to hit the ship at all.
It is a sensor designed to detect the massive disturbance in the Earth's natural magnetic field caused by the huge steel mass of a passing cargo ship. The U-boat captain calculates the depth of the enemy ship's keel and sets the torpedo to run several feet deeper than the ship itself.
The torpedo passes completely underneath the ship, the sensor detects the magnetic shadow of the steel above it, and it detonates the warhead in the open water directly under the center of the hull.
Why is an explosion in the water worse than an explosion against the side of the ship?
It comes down to basic fluid dynamics and structural physics. A massive steel cargo ship's structural integrity relies entirely on the water beneath it, supporting its immense weight evenly, from bow to stern.
When a large torpedo warhead detonates directly beneath the keel, it instantly vaporizes the water, creating a massive, rapidly expanding void. A giant bubble of gas in the ocean, directly beneath the dead center of the ship.
For a microscopic fraction of a second, the middle of the heavy steel ship is suspended in midair inside that gas bubble, with absolutely no water supporting it.
The sheer unsupported gravity of the heavy bow and the heavy stern causes the steel keel to literally snap in half under its own immense weight. The gas bubble then collapses, a massive geyser of water shoots upward through the cracked hull, and the ship sinks almost instantly.
Breaking a ship's back from underneath is infinitely more lethal and efficient than punching a hole in its side. The tactical goal was absolute efficiency. One torpedo, one sunken ship.
Armed with these silent torpedoes and devastating magnetic detonators and equipped with sophisticated short and long-wave radio transmitters, Karl Dönitz was finally able to implement the terrifying doctrine he had envisioned before the war, the Wolfpack tactics.
The Atlantic Ocean is massive. A single U-boat might patrol for weeks without seeing a ship. Under the Wolfpack doctrine, Dönitz would order dozens of U-boats to spread out in a massive staggered line stretching hundreds of miles across the likely paths of the convoy routes.
When one single U-boat eventually spotted the smoke of a convoy, its strict orders were not to attack.
Instead, that single submarine would remain on the surface, hold down below the horizon, and act as a shadow. It would use its radio to continuously transmit the convoy's speed, heading, and defensive composition back to naval headquarters in France.
Headquarters would then broadcast a homing signal, calling in every single other U-boat in the sector. Over the course of a day or two, 5, 10, or sometimes 20 U-boats would converge on the convoy's position.
They would wait for the cover of absolute darkness. Then, acting in coordination, they would all surface simultaneously and charge into the middle of the convoy at high speed on their diesel engines.
By attacking at night on the surface from multiple directions simultaneously, they completely overwhelmed the defensive screens of the British escort destroyers.
In 1940, the geopolitical map shifted heavily in Germany's favor. After the rapid, successful invasions of France and Norway, the German Navy gained access to massive, direct coastal bases right on the Atlantic Ocean. Places like Lorient and Brest in France.
This meant U-boats no longer had to waste weeks navigating the dangerous, heavily mined choke points around the north of the British Isles to reach the open hunting grounds. They could simply sail straight out into the deep water.
This period of early success became legendary among the submarine crews. They referred to it as the happy time die glückliche Zeit. They were devastating British convoys at night with near impunity.
But their strategic success was constantly diluted by political interference from the very top. Adolf Hitler, despite his military successes on land, had a paranoid, almost irrational fear of an Allied amphibious invasion of Norway to reclaim the territory.
Ignoring Dönitz's pleas to concentrate all forces in the crucial Atlantic convoy routes, Hitler constantly meddled in naval deployment. He forced the Navy to keep a significant portion of their most capable U-boats uselessly parked in the freezing remote fjords of the Arctic Circle to guard against an invasion that wasn't coming.
Furthermore, when the Italian Navy struggled in the Mediterranean, Hitler ordered dozens of U-boats to navigate the incredibly dangerous Straits of Gibraltar to support Erwin Rommel's land forces in North Africa.
Every U-boat sent to the Mediterranean or the Arctic was a U-boat removed from the primary objective of starving Britain.
But the narrative drastically shifts again in December 1941, when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor in the United States officially enters the war against the Axis powers. Looking at the history, you would logically expect the U.S. Navy to look at the massive shipping losses the British suffered over the previous 2 years, copy the British homework, and instantly mandate the convoy system along the American coastline.
Right.
Wrong. In what historians look back on as an incredible display of institutional naval arrogance, the commander of the U.S. fleet, Admiral Ernest King, aggressively resisted the implementation of convoys. It was a staggering miscalculation. The prevailing belief among some top U.S. naval brass was that their fast, heavily armed destroyers were better utilized going on the offensive, actively hunting U-boats in the open ocean, rather than passively playing defense by escorting slow, lumbering cargo ships.
Consequently, merchant ships were ordered to simply sail independently along the standard shipping lanes of the American eastern seaboard.
Which meant these isolated, defenseless cargo ships were sailing right off the coast of New York, New Jersey, and Florida. And to make matters worse, the coastal cities hadn't instituted wartime blackouts. They were still fully illuminated.
The U-boat commanders who crossed the Atlantic couldn't believe their luck. They initiated what they called the Second Happy Time in early 1942. They didn't even need to use complex targeting math.
They would just sit a few miles offshore at night and watch as massive American oil tankers perfectly silhouetted themselves against the bright neon lights of Miami or Atlantic City. It was an absolute shooting gallery. They feasted on undefended shipping all along the coast and pushed deep into the Gulf of Mexico.
But the tide of an industrial war is fickle. By mid-1942, the sheer unsustainable volume of sunken American ships finally forced Admiral King to relent.
The U.S. Navy implemented a rigid, interlocking coastal convoy system, immediately pushing the U-boats away from the shorelines and back into the treacherous mid-Atlantic gap. And this is where the grand turning point of the submarine war begins.
The climax of this entire technological and strategic struggle occurred over the course of 1941 to 1943. And it began in the shadows of intelligence. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, aided by the capture of several codebooks from damaged submarines, managed to fundamentally crack the German naval Enigma cipher.
This is a massive, silent victory. By reading the daily Enigma transmissions, the British Admiralty could suddenly see the locations of the waiting Wolfpack patrol lines on their maps. They began secretly routing the massive supply convoys hundreds of miles out of their way, completely bypassing the waiting submarines.
The German commanders were baffled as the ocean seemingly emptied of targets. But even when the Germans changed their cipher keys and locked the British out of reading the actual messages, the Allies had developed another, equally devastating technological countermeasure.
The U-boat's greatest tactical asset, their ability to coordinate via long-range radio, became their fatal flaw.
Because every time a U-boat keyed its microphone to transmit a sighting report, it sent a burst of electromagnetic energy into the atmosphere. The Allies introduced a technology called high-frequency direction finding, commonly nicknamed HFDUF. They installed these highly sensitive radio antennas on the masts of the escort destroyers, protecting the convoys.
Let's explain how HFDUF actually kills a submarine. When a U-boat surfaces on the horizon to radio the Wolfpack, the HFDUF antenna on a British destroyer picks up the signal. The operator gets a direct line of bearing pointing exactly toward the origin of the transmission.
If two different ships in the convoy pick up the same signal, they simply draw two lines on a map. Where those lines cross triangulation is exactly where the U-boat is sitting.
The escort commander instantly detaches a fast destroyer to race down that bearing. The U-boat commander, completely unaware he's been triangulated, suddenly sees a massive warship bearing down on him at 30 knots, dropping depth charges before the rest of the Wolfpack can even arrive.
And when the Allied destroyers hunted them down, they weren't just relying on old-fashioned depth charges anymore. They deployed new, terrifying anti-submarine weapons, most notably the Hedgehog system.
Right, the Hedgehog. A standard depth charge is basically a barrel of explosives dropped off the back of a ship. It uses a hydrostatic fuse to explode at a preset depth. But the problem is, as a destroyer drives over a submarine to drop the depth charge off the stern, the noise of its own propellers completely blinds its sonar.
For crucial minutes, the destroyer loses track of where the sub is, giving the U-boat a chance to turn and evade. The depth charges explode, churning up the water, but you never really know if you hit anything.
The Hedgehog solved that geometry problem entirely. Instead of dropping barrels off the back, the Hedgehog was a massive mortar system mounted on the front deck of the destroyer.
It fired a circular grid of dozens of smaller, highly explosive projectiles hundreds of feet ahead of the attacking ship, right where the sonar operator was pointing.
Crucially, these projectiles didn't use depth fuses. They used contact fuses. They sank rapidly through the water, and they only detonated if they physically struck the steel hull of the submarine.
Therefore, if a destroyer fired a Hedgehog volley and the crew heard an underwater explosion, They knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that they had scored a lethal hit.
All of these Allied countermeasures, the Enigma code breaking, the Huff-Duff triangulation, the deployment of long-range radar-equipped patrol planes covering the mid-Atlantic gap, and the lethal accuracy of the Hedgehog, all violently converged in the spring of 1943.
It culminated in a month the German Navy remembers simply as Black May. The U-boat losses became absolutely catastrophic. The Wolfpacks were trying to attack heavily defended convoys and were being slaughtered.
Germany was losing submarines vastly faster than their shipyards could build them, and worse, vastly faster than they were sinking Allied merchant ships. The economic math had inverted.
On May 24, 1943, Karl Dönitz looked at the horrific casualty reports and made the painful decision to officially halt the Atlantic campaign, ordering his surviving boats to retreat. The golden age of the Wolfpack was definitively over.
The final toll of the war is incredibly grim. The U-boats sank nearly 3,000 Allied ships over 6 years, but the cost was staggering. Of the 11,181 German U-boats that entered operational service, an astonishing 785 were destroyed by Allied action.
The hunters had definitively become the hunted. Over 30,000 U-boat crewmen lost their lives, a casualty rate of nearly 75%, one of the highest of any military branch in any nation during the war.
But the German High Command, facing the prospect of losing the war entirely, refused to give up on the submarine concept. This leads us directly into a fascinating era of rapid, frantic engineering. We enter Part 6, Desperate Innovations, covering 1943 to 1945.
This raises an important question for military historians. What exactly happens when a sophisticated military machine realizes its primary weapon is obsolete, but the war of survival is still raging? It drives a furious, almost desperate scramble for radical technological leaps.
The fundamental problem was obvious. The U-boats needed to get drastically faster underwater, and they needed to stay hidden underwater significantly longer.
The surface of the ocean now entirely belonged to Allied aircraft equipped with microwave radar. Surfacing to run the diesel engines, even at night, was practically a death sentence.
To solve this, the engineers looked backward to a concept developed before the war. Back in 1940, a brilliant, eccentric engineer named Helmuth Walter had designed an experimental submarine called the V-80, or the Type XVAA.
Walter didn't want to use heavy electric batteries for underwater travel. He wanted to use a revolutionary high-speed turbine. But a turbine requires combustion, which requires oxygen. So Walter powered his turbine using highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide.
This is a concept known as air-independent propulsion, or AIP. It's a holy grail of submarine design. Because hydrogen peroxide is a highly unstable chemical that violently breaks down into water and pure oxygen, Walter's engine essentially supplied its own oxygen for combustion while entirely submerged.
It didn't need a snorkel, it didn't need to surface. The performance of this experimental boat was absolutely staggering. Submerged, running on the Walter turbine, the submarine could exceed speeds of 20 knots.
To put that into perspective for you, a standard battery-powered Type 7 U-boat maxed out at an absolute sprint of about 6 knots underwater, and usually cruised at a painfully slow, creeping 4 knots just to save battery life.
The Walter boat was a rocket ship. It could literally outrun many Allied surface warships while remaining completely invisible beneath the waves.
It sounds like the ultimate wonder weapon, the technological silver bullet that could have won the Battle of the Atlantic. But the reality of wartime logistics intervened, revealing a fatal flaw.
Once the Walter submarine burned through its internal supply of volatile hydrogen peroxide fuel, it was dead in the water. Unlike lead-acid electric batteries, which could be recharged indefinitely by simply running the onboard diesel engines on the surface, hydrogen peroxide was a highly refined, exotic chemical.
It could not be manufactured at sea. And by 1944, a heavily bombed, resource-starved Germany simply did not possess the massive, specialized industrial capacity required to synthesize the millions of gallons of high-grade hydrogen peroxide necessary to fuel an entire operational fleet of these submarines.
The Navy ordered 24 of them, but they only managed to build 3 prototypes, and none ever saw combat.
But the engineering effort wasn't a total loss. While the chemical engine was a logistical failure, the physical design of the Walter submarines was brilliant.
To store all that massive volume of hydrogen peroxide fuel, Walter had designed hulls that were very large, very deep, and incredibly streamlined for high-speed underwater travel.
The German naval architects looked at these blueprints and realized they could simply take that massive hydrodynamic hull design and instead of filling the massive lower decks with exotic chemical fuels, just pack the space wall to wall with an unprecedented number of massive conventional lead-acid batteries.
And that pragmatic pivot became the Type XE1, universally known as the Electroboot. This vessel represents a massive fundamental turning point in global naval architecture.
Every submarine we have discussed up to this point, from the U-1 to the Type 7, was essentially a surface ship that possessed the neat tactical trick of occasionally diving underwater for short, slow periods to execute an attack or hide from a destroyer.
Their primary mode of travel was on the surface. The Electroboot was different. It was the first true modern submarine. Its streamlined shape and massive battery capacity meant it was designed primarily, fundamentally, to operate underwater.
It boasted unprecedented underwater speed and could remain completely submerged for days at a time without surfacing. Recognizing that this was their only hope, the German Armaments Ministry completely overhauled submarine production to build the Type XE-1.
To circumvent the constant devastating Allied bombing raids on the coastal shipyards, they pioneered a radical new manufacturing system. The submarine was not built in a single dockyard.
Instead, it was constructed in massive, completely prefabricated steel sections at heavy engineering factories scattered deep inland across Germany. These completed, fully wired chunks were then transported by rail or barge to concrete bunkers on the coast for final, rapid assembly.
It was an incredible industrial achievement. Alongside a smaller, highly maneuverable coastal version known as the Type XE-3, the Electroboot were intended to completely turn the tide of the naval war, rendering Allied radar and escorts obsolete.
But again, it was a profound case of too little, too late. The complex new system suffered from teething problems and the logistics network was collapsing. Only 2 massive Type Xs ever actually set out on an active combat patrol before the complete collapse of the German military and the surrender in May 1945.
But because those revolutionary Electroboot were taking entirely too long to design and build, the Navy desperately needed a stopgap measure to keep their existing, aging, highly vulnerable fleet of Type Cs and Type IXs alive in the Atlantic.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because they resorted to a piece of captured technology. Back in 1940, during the invasion of the Netherlands, the Germans captured several Dutch submarines in dry dock that were equipped with a unique, highly experimental device called a Schnorchel, or a snorkel.
For 3 years, the arrogant German high command completely ignored the device. But by late 1943, desperate for a way to let their boats breathe without exposing them to radar, they rushed to install massive, folding snorkels onto every U-boat they had.
The snorkel was essentially a heavy, retractable double-pipe system that was raised up on a hydraulic hinge. The top of the pipe sat just above the crests of the ocean waves, while the massive steel hull of the submarine remained safely submerged at periscope depth.
One pipe actively sucked in fresh atmospheric air to feed the massive diesel engines, and the other pipe forcefully blew the heavy exhaust gases out into the ocean. In theory, it was an elegant tactical solution.
It allowed the U-boats to run their powerful diesel engines, travel at faster speeds, and recharge their depleted batteries without ever exposing their vulnerable hulls on the surface.
It sounds perfect on paper, but reading the accounts from the engineers and the sailors who had to actually use these things, in practice, operating a snorkel in the North Atlantic was a physical and psychological nightmare.
For starters, the pipe created immense hydrodynamic drag. The submarine could only use the snorkel at a maximum speed of about 8 knots. If they pushed the engines any faster, the sheer physical force of the water rushing against the pipe would literally snap it clean off the deck, flooding the boat.
Furthermore, the acoustic reality of running massive, vibrating diesel engines while completely submerged meant the noise echoed through the water and completely deafened the U-boat's own highly sensitive hydrophone listening arrays.
By using the snorkel to hide from radar, they made themselves completely blind to the approach of Allied sonar destroyers.
And then there was the acute physical danger to the crew itself. The Atlantic Ocean is never flat. It is a chaotic environment of massive swells. The air intake pipe of the snorkel was equipped with an automatic float valve on the top.
This valve was designed to instantly snap shut if a large ocean wave crashed over the top of the pipe, preventing thousands of gallons of seawater from pouring directly into the engine room and sinking the boat.
This is the part that genuinely gives me claustrophobia. Imagine this scenario. The boat is submerged at periscope depth. The 2 massive 2,000 horsepower diesel engines are roaring, demanding colossal, staggering amounts of oxygen every single second to maintain combustion.
Suddenly, a large wave rolls over the snorkel mast. The float valve slams shut to stop the water, but the massive diesel engines don't magically stop running the instant that valve closes. They keep firing.
And because the air intake pipe is sealed off, those engines instantly start desperately sucking huge volumes of air right out of the only place left, the sealed crew compartments.
Because the entire interior volume of the pressure hull was utilized as an air buffer, the engines would instantaneously draw thousands of cubic feet of air out of the living spaces. It created a sudden, violent, extreme drop in barometric pressure, a vacuum effect inside the submarine.
The physical trauma of this on the human body is horrifying. The pressure drop was so severe and so instantaneous that it would literally suck the air out of the sailors' lungs.
The extreme pressure differential between the inside of the sailors' heads and the cabin air could instantly burst the eardrums of every man on board, causing agonizing, incapacitating pain and permanent hearing loss.
The diesel engines would eventually choke out and stall from the lack of oxygen, plunging the boat into total silence and darkness, leaving a terrified, bleeding crew gasping for breath until the wave passed and the valve opened again, rushing air back in.
It was a terrifying, deeply flawed mechanical device born of absolute sheer strategic desperation. Ultimately, neither the stopgap terror of the Schnorchel nor the technological miracle of the Electroboot could prevent the total military and economic collapse of the Third Reich.
With the unconditional surrender of Germany in May 1945, the story of the U-boat as a weapon of global terror came to an abrupt, definitive end. In an echo of the end of World War I, hundreds of surviving surrendered U-boats were towed out into the deep Atlantic by the victorious Allies and systematically sunk by naval gunfire and explosives during Operation Deadlight.
But you cannot permanently suppress brilliant engineering. The knowledge remains. Which brings us to our final act, exploring the post-war era from 1945 to the present day.
Following the devastation of World War II, the new nation of West Germany is, for a second time in a century, strictly banned from possessing a submarine fleet. But the geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting drastically.
The Soviet Union and the West divide Europe. The Cold War begins. By 1954 and 1955, West Germany is formally integrated into the NATO alliance.
The Western allies look at the map and realize they have a massive strategic vulnerability in the Baltic Sea, right on the border of the Soviet bloc. They desperately need the Germans to help secure it.
So the restrictions are lifted, and the newly formed Bundesmarine is given permission to design and build a small fleet of specialized 350-ton coastal defense submarines.
And the German engineers immediately set out to solve the unique tactical problems of the Baltic Sea. Their first major post-war attempts were the Type 201 and Type 202 classes.
The Baltic is notoriously shallow, making it an ideal environment for the deployment of thousands of bottom-dwelling magnetic naval mines. To counter this threat, the German designers decided to build the pressure hulls of these new submarines out of a completely revolutionary, non-magnetic high-tension steel alloy.
The theory was that a non-magnetic hull would allow the submarine to sail safely over magnetic minefields without triggering them, and it would also make them completely invisible to the magnetic anomaly detectors flown by Soviet anti-submarine patrol planes. It was a brilliant, highly advanced idea in theory.
In theory. But in practice, metallurgy is a cruel mistress. By 1963, operational testing revealed that this new wonder metal was an absolute disaster. The non-magnetic steel was highly susceptible to severe galvanic corrosion in saltwater.
Microcracks began forming uncontrollably all over the structural pressure hulls. The integrity of the submarines was failing so rapidly that the Navy literally had to resort to coating the exterior hulls in thick zinc paint just to try and physically slow down the rotting of the metal.
They were forced into a terrifying routine of constantly taking the boats into deep water and retesting how far they could safely dive before the hull threatened to implode. It was a massive, embarrassing engineering failure, forcing them to scrap the exotic material entirely and go back to the drawing board to design the Type 205 using highly reliable, traditional high-tension steel.
But the hallmark of modern German engineering is rapid iteration and recovery from failure. By 1968, having perfected their designs with traditional materials, they launched the Type 209. And the Type 209 is arguably one of the most commercially and tactically successful submarine designs of the entire late 20th century.
Germany realized a massive gap in the global arms market. While their own defense needs only required small coastal subs, dozens of allied and non-aligned navies around the world, nations with long coastlines but limited budgets, desperately needed reliable, modern, medium-sized diesel-electric submarines to protect their waters.
But they simply couldn't afford the massive research and development costs to design them internally. So German shipyards created the Type 209 not just as a submarine, but as a highly customizable modular export platform.
It became an absolute global juggernaut of arms exportation. The designers offered the Type 209 in 5 different size variants, ranging from a compact 1,000 tons up to an ocean-going 1,500 tons. You could basically order it off a menu.
The Hellenic Navy of Greece immediately recognized the value and bought 4. By the year 2002, German shipyards had constructed an astonishing 51 of these U-boats for 13 different sovereign navies across the globe.
The political and geographic reach is incredible. They built them for the Argentinian Navy, who ordered massive, custom 2,000-ton versions for deep ocean patrols. They engineered highly customized, politically sensitive variants for the Israeli Navy, which, due to complex geopolitical optics at the time, were actually physically assembled in shipyards in England by Vickers using the German blueprints.
The historical arc here is truly incredible. Over the span of half a century, Germany went from being a nation globally legally banned from even touching a submarine blueprint at Versailles to becoming the single preeminent exporter of advanced non-nuclear submarines in the entire world.
And they haven't stopped pushing the boundaries of physics and engineering. This brings us squarely into the modern era of naval warfare, defined by the highly advanced Type 212, Type 214, and Type 218 submarines.
The defining hallmark of these modern 21st century U-boats is the successful return to the holy grail of submarine design, air-independent propulsion, or AIP. If we look back at Helmuth Walter's failed, highly volatile hydrogen peroxide turbine from the 1940s, we see that the fundamental strategic concept, a submarine generating its own power to stay submerged indefinitely without needing outside atmospheric air, was absolutely correct.
The idea was sound. The chemical technology simply took 60 years of development to finally catch up.
Exactly. Instead of relying on a dangerous, explosive chemical reaction like hydrogen peroxide, the modern Type 212 utilizes highly advanced aerospace-grade hydrogen fuel cells.
These cells take compressed liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, stored safely in specialized tanks outside the pressure hull, and combine them chemically to generate massive amounts of direct electrical current to run the propulsion motors.
The only physical byproduct of this entire chemical process is pure distilled water, which is simply pumped out into the ocean or used by the crew. There are no massive, vibrating, air-breathing diesel engines required to charge the batteries while underwater.
Because the fuel cells have virtually no moving mechanical parts, these modern submarines are incredibly, almost impossibly quiet. They emit practically zero acoustic signature, making them the ultimate stealth hunters.
They can remain completely submerged, patrolling the deep ocean without ever needing to raise a snorkel mast or break the surface for literally weeks at a time. They are currently the spearhead of the modern German and Italian navies, while the export variant, the Type 214, has been sold to South Korea, Portugal, and Turkey.
And the massive, highly advanced Type 218 is currently being custom-built for the Republic of Singapore.
It is a profound, sprawling technological journey. We have traced the U-boat from Wilhelm Bauer's 1850 Brandtaucher, a leaky, terrifying iron coffin powered by a human treadmill that plummeted to the bottom of Kiel Harbor on its very first dive through the brutal industrial slaughter of the Atlantic Wolfpacks, and finally arriving at these ultra-quiet, fuel cell-powered leviathans that are currently silently patrolling the coastlines of the modern world.
It really is a profound testament to relentless engineering, adaptation, and the harsh realities of warfare. We've spent the last hour looking at over a century of human beings pushing the absolute breaking limits of their own physical and psychological endurance.
We've talked about the agonizing claustrophobia, the deafening noise, the sheer terror of depth charges exploding in the dark, the foul air, and the bursting eardrums.
All of that suffering, all of that endurance is required just to survive inside these fragile metal tubes suspended beneath the crushing weight of the ocean.
But as we conclude this deep dive and look to the horizon of naval warfare, navies around the world are no longer focusing exclusively on human endurance. They are aggressively developing massive, AI-driven, entirely uncrewed, autonomous submarines.
And that reality leaves us with a lingering, somewhat unsettling thought to mull over as we wrap up today's deep dive. For over a century, the size, the shape, and the operational limits of every single submarine ever built have been fundamentally constrained by the squishy, fragile human element.
You have to design massive, heavy steel pressure hulls solely to protect human lungs from the ocean's weight.
You have to dedicate huge amounts of interior space to galleys for cooking food, bunks for sleeping, complex chemical scrubbers to manufacture oxygen, and you have to design tactical limits to manage the profound psychological toll of the dark and the deep on the human mind.
But when we look to the future,
When we completely remove that fragile human element from the depths, when a submarine is no longer a life support system, but simply a cold, calculating artificial intelligence housed inside a pressure-proof titanium casing that never needs to breathe, never needs to eat, and never needs to sleep.
Right.
What unimaginable shapes, what crushing depths, and what terrifying new tactical realities will the U-boats of the 21st century take?
that's a chilling thought.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this immersive journey into the history and the future of the deep today. Keep questioning the history you think you know, keep looking below the surface of the narrative, and keep diving deep into the things that make you curious. Farewell.